Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to present our speaker today, Dr. Raphael, Associate Professor with the University of Toronto. He's a good friend and a good colleague of mine. We worked together for so many years. Dr. Raphael is one of the very few pathologists in Toronto who also has a master's in education, and he used that to advance his career in medical education. He was the director of the residency program for so many years. Dr. Raphael, by training, is a head and neck and endocrine pathologist. He did his residency in the University of Western Ontario, London, Ontario. He had his fellowship at the University Health Network in Toronto. And currently, he is the chief and medical director of pathology at North York General Hospital. His career is mainly in medical leadership. He was also the chief of pathology at Markham Stouffville Hospital in Toronto. These are some of the teaching university hospitals in Toronto. Before that, he was the deputy chief in Sunnybrook Hospital. He and I always joked about something is wrong with us because every time we practice somewhere, someone is merging hospitals, either merging or demerging. So today, Dr. Raphael is going to share some of his experience and stories about the topic.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Mahmoud, of course, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here, and putting together this talk has been a very enjoyable experience for me, actually. So, what are we going to talk about? Can everyone hear me, first of all? Yes, good, okay. So, as you know, in medicine, we like to start out with a case. And usually the case is the thing in medical education that involves and draws in the audience. So the case is going to be me, my own merger journey. And I'm going to talk about what I've been, my merging and unmerging. And really, until the last 3 years, I've never worked in a hospital that was not either merging, demerging, remerging. It's been a continual thing for my own journey. The topics I will cover are the persistent urge to merge. Why are they always looking to merge? I'll get into some of the things that hospitals think about when they're considering a merger, how to merge. I'll talk about culture, because medical culture is the thing that probably the people who work in the hospital, and the staff, medical staff and non-medical staff, are most interested in. So, I'll talk about successes and failures of mergers, what characteristics are there of a successful merger and what characteristics of mergers make them unsuccessful. I'll talk a little bit specifically about MDs and their relationships to mergers, and then we'll talk very briefly about the record of mergers in the United States in terms of efficiency, cost, etc. And then the last topic is mergers, get used to it. Okay, so who am I? So I got my fellowship in anatomic pathology in 1990, and I began to practice in the city I trained, as many people do, which was a city of 400,000 people. And at that time, we were undergoing a complete merger of all labs to one site at the university. I then moved to Toronto in 2000, and I experienced the merger and divorce of 2 hospitals and labs into Toronto over the period of 2000 to 2006, and that was the time when I met Dr. Khalifa. He was a member of the other hospital, and in fact is the only surviving member of that hospital. He was.
They all died.
In a sense, he was the only one who merged. The other ones all left. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of the background of how things were in the 90s when the hospitals in my first town and also carrying over into 2000 and the second in Toronto were going on. What was the political climate? What was it like during the mergers? And as you know, in Canada, the way we move around the money is different, but the necessities and the business realities of medicine are similar, okay? So in the early 1990s, we elected a very conservative government in the province of Ontario, and they were going to cut back and eliminate waste. And they sent around a commission across the entire province, which at that time was a jurisdiction of about 10 million people, and they decreed which hospitals would merge. This was a huge uproar. So this is some of the reporting at the time which I dug up, and I found Joy Melvin was the health reporter for one of the large TV networks. She says, "The province says there's more to come, even more hospitals under review in Ontario. But healthcare workers say the battle isn't over yet. Some are looking at appeals, even lawsuits, in a last-ditch effort to keep their hospitals alive. So the Ontario government's Commission on Health Restructuring has recommended some tough medicine, pulling the plug on 10 hospitals in Toronto. The big names, Women's College Hospital, around since the turn of the century, and the Wellesley. 2 other hospitals will be cut back to clinics, and several health programs like dialysis and burn units will merge into existing hospitals. Total savings, $430 million a year. What the report did not include is the human cost. How many healthcare workers will lose their jobs?" So at the beginning of my career, I was sort of immersed in this panic of the merger. And I'll show you a little bit, just as an introduction, and as part of the story of my own journey. This is the hospital I first joined in Toronto. This is Women's College Hospital. This is a hospital right downtown, a block from the medical school, the center of town, a block from the provincial legislature, actually. It was founded by a woman named Emily Stowe. Emily Stowe was the first practicing woman in Canada to practice medicine. She was the first MD. She was, of course, trained here in the United States. There was nowhere in Canada that would train her. So she came back from the United States to Canada. She founded this hospital to allow women to practice. That was how it started. And it had a very proud feminist culture. They didn't even have men on staff for about the first 50 or 60 years. It was a very extraordinary place. This was where I started out. By that time, they were accepting men. I was actually the first, or maybe the second pathologist who was a man in the history of that place. And we started to practice there. And then the province decided to merge us with this. This is Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre. And this was where Dr. Khalifa was working. Sunnybrook is a much bigger place. It's like a little village. And it was founded after the Second World War by the federal government. It was actually it was a vet's hospital. It was the closest Canada has to the VA. And then in the 1960s, the federal government sold it to the University of Toronto for $1 Canadian even. And the deal was, you can have, the University of Toronto will own this hospital, but the hitch is, you have to take care of the veterans in perpetuity. And that was done. These 2 wings here are the veterans' wings, and the veterans are to this day still there. So this was a military hospital, and this was for some reason, and it's also 5 miles away from Women's. It's in the suburbs. So, it was an odd choice to say the least, and culture-wise, it was completely wrong. They couldn't have been more different. And in fact, the interesting thing is that the only thing, these 2 hospitals merged and then unmerged. It was a huge mess. It cost untold millions of dollars and a lot of endless time. The only department that ever successfully merged was the lab. And the lab merged because what they did was they just removed it from Women's College. It was removed and placed in another building, and to this day it is not there. But the rest of the merger never worked out. Okay. For some reason I'm going the wrong way. Okay. After the Women's College and Sunnybrook merger and unmerger, I was left at Sunnybrook because I started at Women's, and then when we merged, I moved up to Sunnybrook, which I grew to love. But then in 2009, it was decided that Sunnybrook itself would merge with the biggest hospital in the country, University Health Network. And this was from 2009 to 2016. It was an attempted lab merger, and it failed. And it took a huge toll on many people and was a very unsuccessful experience. When I left Sunnybrook in 2013, I entered into a new hospital where I became chief, and I entered an MD-initiated lab collaborative. And I'll describe that lab collaborative as we go on. I was also chief of, as Mahmoud mentioned, of 2 hospitals at once. Until this year, I was chief at 2 large community academic hospitals as part of this collaborative. So I have a fair amount of experience in hospitals working together and not working together. Okay, so I did spend some time, just as an introduction, looking at what I could find, and I do apologize. Obviously I don't know very much about the medical situation in Minneapolis, St. Paul, but I tried to find out what I could. And I did find this very interesting article which examined lab employment across a 25-year period here in Minneapolis and St. Paul to do with mergers. And if you look, it's old, right? It ends in 1995. But in 1970, there were 30 hospitals in the Twin Cities with 10,000 beds, 2 blood banks, and 4 clinical labs employing 1,300 people. By the time we got to the end of the study period in 1995, the number of hospitals was down by half to 18. There were only 7,000 beds, but 11 blood banks, clinics, reference labs or HMOs, 3 independent labs, and 2,900 lab employees. So the number of hospitals was much reduced. The number of lab employees was actually up quite a bit. So it's an interesting pattern of, and the number of beds is really down. So you can see in sort of the local experience, actually, this is very typical of what has happened all across North America. Okay, so why do hospitals want to merge? What are the motivations for all of this merger activity? There was particularly an era, they called it, it was in the 1990s, sometimes described in the papers as 1994 to 98 in the United States, the era of merger mania, where there was a huge amount of mergers and decline in hospital numbers. And it's sort of coincidence with what we saw in Minneapolis. Any time of great financial stress in the business environment will cause hospitals to want to merge. And we saw that then, and we're going to see that again. 2/3 of hospitals now, representing 80% of beds, are now part of a larger organization. So mergers are fairly ubiquitous. So the urge to merge is all over. If we look at the era of merger mania, what were the things that propelled people at that time through the 1990s to do so many mergers? What can we learn from that period? It was felt at that time that collaboration rather than competition will decrease healthcare costs, which is an odd idea, and I thought, and which turned out to be untrue, as a matter of fact. It was felt that formation of large groups was fundamental to attracting capital, and this is a continuing story nowadays, particularly as healthcare becomes so much more complex, technically intensive, particularly in labs, and expensive. The for-profit sector saw the not-for-profit as an opportunity. At that time, there was a large perceived threat from capitation schemes, which actually never materialized, probably to a great degree, I think. So these were the factors that really propelled people to merge at that time and saw such intense merger activity. In terms of financial mergers, of financial motivation specifically for mergers at any time, hospitals with a high debt load and those that are unable to compete for patients or for talent. When I graduated from medical school, I didn't know this, but I'm the talent. That's what the administrators call us. It's like working in the circus. I'm sorry, I hope there's no real administrators. Or talent. They cannot, a financially weak organization can obviously not compete for the best doctors because they can't pay them or they can't give them the stuff that they want to do their craft with. Some hospitals, many hospitals, get into an area called merge or sell. particularly if they have outlived their particular mission. So a hospital which, for example, let's say it's a hospital that was founded downtown to help the poor immigrants or something like that, and now downtown has gentrified into wealthy code writers and things like that. They don't need this community hospital. It's outlived its mission. So those hospitals become financially weaker, and they either have to get out of the business and dissolve or merge with another place. Hospitals merge for growth, especially to adjust to technological changes, disease changes, and population changes. And for many institutions, it's a way to increase market share in a particular area. Hospitals sometimes merge to actually preserve their mission, so that if they feel threatened, they will merge. If they feel their financial stability is threatened, they will merge in order to strengthen it. But they're trying to strengthen their primary mission, which may be religious, may be academic. It may be that they're afraid that they're going to be bought by somebody from another part of the country. They don't want that, so they want to merge with someone locally to keep it in the community. And then there's the defense imperative. And none of us should underestimate the defense imperative. This means that the hospital is merging because it's afraid somebody is going to take it over who they really don't want to. And this is actually a concept in the literature called the lunatic organization. And it describes a corporation which is intent on merging and taking over everybody, run by a lunatic. And in Ontario, we did see this. One hospital, its expressed known intent, verbalized, was that it would form the network for the whole province. The lab there would be the lab, and that we would use their methods, computer system, organization, leadership, etc., across a huge geographic area with now 12, 13 million people. Okay. If we move to the next topic of once a hospital decides, for whatever reason, for whatever financial reason, etc., is that it needs to merge. How does it start out with? Well, the proper way is that just like when you're looking for a job, you're supposed to do a SWOT analysis. I used to go over this with the residents. You look at your strengths, your weaknesses, opportunities, and threats to your institution to decide what you need. And this information is composed by the management, but it's very important to know that the decision to merge is a decision only for the board. The management of the hospital will not properly make that decision. It is a board thing, and the board really has to be involved. Okay. We look for in the SWOT analysis on both sides, on both your hospital and the proposed partner, the 4 C's of mergers: capability, clinical strength, what can they do that you don't do, or that maybe you both do well, and culture, does your culture match? And we'll talk about this more. Capital, who has the money? You don't want to merge with an organization that is going down the tubes. Clout, do they have negotiating clout with doctors groups, with the state government, with other hospitals, with insurance payers, etc. And now more and more computers. Because the cost of IT is so expensive, but IT is so necessary, people try to get around that by merging for computer systems rather than building it themselves. And as you all know, working in a lab, building a computer system is agony. We look for geography, but it's not straightforward. Some organizations want somebody close, but it's sort of like being married. Some want them close, but not too close, because they think we don't want them to completely take us over, so we'll have them in another town, right? They look for the type of organization. Often it's a match of religious organizations have been very successful, Catholic hospitals primarily, for-profit, community-based, and of course academic. And for this organization, the academic match would be very important. And we look for the size of the partner, including the breadth of services that can be offered. Okay. So once the board decides that a merger is necessary, and perhaps they have somebody in mind, a merger committee is struck, and that usually is composed of management, members of the board, doctors, university members, community members, and patients. And then the next big step is to hire the lawyers. The lawyers, it's emphasized in the descriptions of mergers, cannot be hired too early. I don't know if the lawyers wrote the articles, that's possible. But the lawyers, the legal gymnastics of a large merger are such that the lawyers come in very early. Confidentiality agreements must be signed early because you have to be able to examine the financial books of the other organization to make sure they're not in some sort of disastrous debt, or they're not mixed up with, some sort of real estate scheme or something like that. So they have to be able to tell you everything in confidence. In the United States in particular, antitrust implications are very large. The federal government will interpret a merger of hospitals in one community as perhaps collusion to raise prices. And this has been, many mergers have been scuttled on antitrust implications. And a communication plan is very necessary very soon. There is nothing that lights up the hospital gossip tree like a possible merger. So the leadership team of the hospital, the management, must start very early to start to decide how to message this and how to convey what they would want to do in a way that will not cause not only panic, but people start to leave if they feel threatened. Okay. After that, what is signed is called an MOU. An MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, is like getting engaged. Okay. So the two hospitals say, we want to merge. We signed an MOU. And that's the first thing. That's the beginning of really serious merger activity. Both organizations then commence due diligence. That means they really get into the books. They really look at every aspect of each other's organizations to find out all the warts. The final agreement will then actually be signed. It's very much emphasized that if problems are not resolved, the merger, if the problems are not resolved at the outset, the merger will fail. Most mergers fail. If it's not perfect at the beginning, it's really not going to be perfect in a year. So this is a everybody has to do a lot of tiring homework. Most mergers cost in the millions of dollars just to negotiate. Okay, we're talking about a huge commitment on the part of hospitals. And the lawyers say, and I read about this, it's called pay me now or pay me later. So unless you hire and get things right at the beginning, when you start to want to divorce the other organization because your original plan was not well thought out, you are going to really have to pay for lawyers. And anyone who has been divorced knows how costly that can be. Let's talk about culture. And culture is the most interesting part, I think, for a medical audience in this. What is medical culture? And the best definition I read was the way we do things around here. To a degree, it's really dictated by the business realities of the hospital, competition with other organizations, relationships with medical groups, etc. It's also based very much on values. And let's look at, my own story. Well, the culture of women's college was very, very much about feminism and was quite left-wing. The culture of Sunnybrook was a very proud military tradition, and they had very strong cultures. Who were their heroes? Well, obviously the heroes of a hospital, usually the heroes of an academic hospital are, for example, a Nobel laureate, somebody like that, someone who has really excelled at research. The hero of a community hospital will never be someone like that. It will be someone, usually someone who dedicated their lives to patient care. What is the history? I've sort of talked about that. What are the rites and rituals? How do they honor people? How do they honor achievement, etc.? But most importantly, what are the personal networks? We can never underestimate that. Did the CEOs, I'm not kidding, were they in medical school together? This can be very important. Did they like each other in medical school? Do the pathologists like each other in the different hospitals, or do they consider each other incompetent? And I've seen both. We can never underestimate, particularly in labs, which are a small community, the depth of personal networks and the importance of personal networks when we consider hospital culture and whether a merger will work. Okay. So culture is very much a key component in pre-merger evaluation. They say that culture is the shadow of the CEO. Hospitals have a history, but who is the CEO at the moment and what is he or she pushing? And I certainly have seen that myself, that the CEO has a huge influence on the culture and feeling of an organization as he or she pushes through a certain... For example, if you have a CEO who is very much into research, you will have a very different culture in your hospital than one who is into, say, family-centered care. It will make a huge difference to how the hospital feels and functions. To make a successful merger, you focus on shared values and shared behaviors to bring the cultures together. You look for, obviously, commonalities. And it's very much a matter of winning hearts and minds. The shared culture eventually has to make both business and clinical sense, but it is very important that the two organizations eventually believe they are on a shared mission. And this can take an enormous amount of time. The hospitals that were forced to merge in the early 1990s in Ontario still maintain separate cultures. You ask people, where do you work? They don't talk about the merged organization, they talk about the original organization. It just, a lot of times it never took. And so it can take decades for culture to be worked out. I have seen it where people, I do know a place where they actually have forgotten where they all started out, but that's unusual. Usually faith-based organizations are ahead of non-faith-based in terms of the merging of culture because they already have a set culture in which they believe. For other hospitals, it could be a culture of community-based care or affordable care. That could be the mission of the joint organization. Obviously, for-profit hospitals or academic institutions, they can have a different mission which they can put their culture into, put their shared culture into. In terms of culture, the other thing is how much autonomy will you give the organizations that are a part of a merger. And this is a very, very big balancing act for the new organization. And one nice sentence I read was that there should be unity in essentials, liberty in non-essentials, and respect in all things. So you don't have to be completely the same across an organization, but you do have to respect each other's cultures. And this is where many organizations fail. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little practical example of culture and cultures that we have tried to make. The lab collaborative I belong to is a loose organization called the GTA Labs, the Greater Toronto Area Labs. And we wrote up a list of principles when we merged, and that's the basis of our organization. Now remember, this is an organization of 2 community hospitals, 2 community academic, so mainly community, and 1 high-level academic hospital. So we wrote, consultation and second opinion are an essential part of pathology practice. No one medical practitioner has all the answers. We did not want an organization where it was assumed that those who sit in the building downtown are right, because that's wrong. They're not always right. Having sat in those buildings, I know that. It informs our belief that no one institution has all the solutions to all problems at all sites. So this is the respect part. We share manpower and resources only where necessary, basically. So we do not insist that all of our tubular adenomas are referred from our community sites to our academic sites, because you don't have to. It's just a waste of time. We always look at fiscal responsibility. We always have to be thinking about the money, because that's life. We try to utilize existing technologies in IT, existing networks. We did not buy a huge computer network in order to make this organization because the hospitals wouldn't have invested in it. And there are ways, in the province of Ontario, we do have a common information technology system that we can all put our laboratory data into and all our clinical data into. And it's slow at the moment, but it's getting pretty good. So we can actually see all of each other's clinical notes. We can see each other's laboratory data. We didn't have to buy it or build it. We all have our own lab information systems, but we have common data, which makes it actually quite a bit easier. And we have very much a ground-up philosophy. So when I became chief at the other hospital, at the other community hospital, They didn't pay my hospital anything. What they did was they sent someone to work at my hospital while I was at that hospital. It was a work exchange. We didn't exchange any dollars. We exchanged work. And that's much easier for labs to do because we can do it ourselves. We didn't have to ask the VP. It was easy. We recognize the role and the value of all institutions and recognize the corporate and medical cultural wisdom of people who are on site. So many people who work in labs have been there. I don't know about here, but many people where I work have been in wherever they've been for, we have people who have worked in labs for 35 years at my own hospital. And you don't just roll over those people and say they don't matter. They know everything. So we value that cultural wisdom. Okay. Let's just move on and talk about the characteristics of a successful merger. And you'll notice that there are fewer characteristics of a successful merger than an unsuccessful merger. Sound business rationale and a long-term commitment is very, very important because these things take a long time. Excellent leadership skills and a sound business plan to affect the business rationale. An unsuccessful merger, lack of a business rationale, meaning you're not merging for business or financial reasons, you've got other reasons, often defensive. Mergers don't work if the CEO isn't sure it's good for his career. Okay, he won't get into it. If the senior leadership team, the vice presidents, are nervous about their jobs, it won't happen. If the board is too trusting of what senior management tells it, there will be problems. If the commitment is superficial, if they really don't believe in it, both the staff and the management of the hospital, it's not going to happen. If a merger is purely done for money, if there is no cultural reasons, no one will buy into it, and it won't work. If the merger is completely defensive, if both organizations are doing it because they're scared of somebody else, often won't work. If a merger is a reaction rather than a strategy. Is a merger is completely based on who went to school with who and who plays golf with who? No, it's not going to work. And most of all, if you just assume that over time the cultural differences will go away, this is often untrue. So as you can see, there is many reasons, even more. Two financially weak organizations, merger based on money coming from the merged authority. Both weak organizations assume that some merged authority will have money to give it while they will completely maintain all autonomy. All of these reasons, or being unable to resolve leadership problems. So instead of having one CEO, you decide to have two co-CEOs. These are all signs of superficial commitment, poorly thought out financial plans, dreaming, etc. And these are many of the reasons why mergers don't work, and most mergers fail. Other problems with mergers are forced merger of medical staffs. Medical staffs do not like to be merged often because of leadership problems, often to do with the labs and radiology. Who will be the chief of the lab? Who will be the chief of radiology? Who will be the chief of anesthesia? And these become very messy. When the foundations merge, there is an assumption that somebody is stealing somebody else's money and that the other partner has taken your foundation's money. I've seen this. So that the donors suddenly dry up and the foundation and the endowment goes down. And this is another reason mergers don't work. Okay. Complete asset mergers are usually more successful. So basically, a merger is like getting in the pool. You have to just run in, jump in. You don't wear your water wings. You have to swim. And you don't hang on to the side, because it's not going to happen. You're just going to get out of the pool. This is just what happens in mergers. Complete asset mergers are more successful. If there are too many out causes in the agreement, those will be used. If there's unused space at the beginning of a merger, such that, for example, say the lab in one hospital is moved to the other site and there's unused space, that's a vacuum. And I will guarantee you that people will begin to fight over that space, and that will be the end of the merger. And the recommendation of the expert, burn the life rafts. If you want the merger to work, it's tough medicine, but you can't get out of it. Okay, let's look at my story. What happened? Women's College Hospital, right? So we merged with Sunnybrook, but there was from day one a huge backlash. The women's group just could not believe it had happened and began to fight on day one to have it reversed. And of course, in the way of governments, it was reversed. The Conservative government, which effected the change, was, as all governments are, booted out of office and replaced by a Liberal government. The Liberal government promised in the election to restore the hospital. This is Women's College Hospital as it was, and this is Women's College Hospital today. They have a new building, very nice, completely rebuilt, and they are completely independent. So they don't have a lab. They buy the lab services from other people, but they are here. They have it's a very nice site. And this is what happens when the medical staffs were not merged, the boards were not merged. They never wanted to do it. Sunnybrook didn't want to do it. And it failed. But it didn't fail fast. And it didn't fail without a lot of trouble. What happens if we have a complete merger? This is another example. This is a downtown hospital in Toronto. This is St. Michael's Hospital, which is actually a Catholic, as you can tell, a Catholic hospital. St. Mike's was merged with an institution at the same time as Sunnybrook and Women's, 6 blocks to the north, called the Wellesley. And what they did, St. Mike's at the beginning, was they knocked the Wellesley down. They destroyed the building. You know what? And they put the Wellesley here. They built an addition to the hospital. And they made it bigger. So the Wellesley, it isn't going anywhere, okay? It's stuck. Where's the Wellesley now? Well, if you look here, the Wellesley has been converted, the site has been converted to a chronic care home called the Wellesley Central Place. It's a very nice chronic care hospital. No acute services at all, okay? The only thing, interestingly, that remains of the Wellesley Hospital is this wall. That's it. So that merger is successful. They will never go back. And it's the difference between how really doing it and kind of sticking your toe in and wondering if you want to do it. Okay. Doctors are a big problem in mergers for the CEO because, as in many things, the CEO doesn't really know who the doctors are. Are they his competitor? Like, for example, radiologists can be the competitor of the hospital when they set up an independent facility, right? Are they customers? Did the clinicians come to the hospital to use the hospital's machinery and services? Are they employees? Like the laboratory physicians are often employees. Are they a partner? The CEO has to have a very clear idea of where the MD is coming, where the MD group is coming from, and that's often very, very difficult for them. So the MDs play a complex and shifting role in the hospital merger, as they often do. They're not as easy as other staff to sort of buttonhole. What is the record of mergers? Now, there's a huge literature on mergers and if they are successful or not, often written in journals of more like health economics, often very, very difficult stuff, a lot of financial mathematics, etc. So what I wanted to just quote was a review article, which is often the best thing to do. And this is written by a man named Weil in Health Sciences Research in 2010. He has extensive experience as a consultant and as a hospital executive. He said that almost all studies indicate that hospital consolidations raises costs by at least 2% in the United States. So they don't actually save money most of the time. Where there is less competition, healthcare costs will rise. It is true. The only cost savings, and I'm sorry to depress you with this, the only cost savings come from when you close the buildings. That's how you save money. And most robust studies, but not all, claim the quality of care will suffer due to the lack of competition. So mergers are not what they're advertised to be a lot of the time. A quote from that article: "Those in leadership positions lack the necessary understanding and appreciation of the differences in cultures, values, and goals. And there is a tendency to overlook medical staff issues such as referral patterns and joint leadership issues in a merger." And these are things which consistently scuttle mergers as time goes by. Okay. So as a final topic, Mergers, get used to it. Why is this? I've gone through this talk. I've told you all of the problems with mergers, all of the difficulties, all of the reasons they don't work. Well, why don't people just give up on them, right? Shouldn't we know by now? No, because the propulsion to merge is so extreme for those in administrative positions. The number of acute beds in the United States decreased from 4.6 to 2.7 per thousand over this 30-year period. That's that's about 40%, right? There just is overcapacity in beds. And what propels that, you and I both know, that's technology. That's not going away. That's a mode of care. You don't need to be in the hospital like you used to. And you don't want to be in the hospital like you used to. So that's not going to change. The current period is very similar to the 1990s merger mania period in terms of the business environment. Interestingly, there were 18 mergers in Minnesota in the 90s and only 3 between 1999 and 2008. So the feeling is that in this area, again, mergers will come back. There are new challenges that will propel mergers. IT costs, which I've already described. Competition, new organisms, which are costly. If you get, for example, in Toronto, we had the SARS epidemic, which was enormously costly for us, and also caused a huge amount of organizational change and cultural change, actually, and was a very challenging period for all of the hospitals. Overseas competition is a reality as well, which wasn't there before in the 1990s. Radiology, of course, we know can now be read in any part of the world. Pathology is not there yet, but maybe one day, who knows? These are other things that cause financial pressures on hospitals. But the feeling now is that the CEOs and senior leadership and hospital consultants have learned in the past 30 years that mergers maybe don't work, but that doesn't mean we're going to be able to rest easy. The feeling is, the opinion I have read, is that closures and acquisitions rather than mergers will be the trend. Hospitals will be closed because that's how you save money, and they will be wholesale acquired rather than merged. They'll just buy another hospital. It won't be the same as a merger of equals or of near equals. And divestitures, that is, getting rid of hospitals or sites that are no longer profitable. So in fact, the news for us is not good as well. There is a consistent business and technical propulsion to merge and to find new partners, and the thinking will in fact probably drive them to more drastic things than they thought of in the past. So that is the end of my formal talk. I am sorry that I brought you such grim news, but that's what Canadians are like, you know. We're kind of a sad bunch. And they're kind of like living in Minnesota, you know. The winter gets to you, it makes you depressed. So,
thank you.
Any questions or comments?
So, thank you, Simon, for the presentation. That was quite cheerful. The one thing that's on our mind, and probably I know you have been through this, is the merger between, not necessarily between two hospitals, but between academic centers or academic institutions and non-academic. You talked about the financial drivers and all of that, but historically speaking, how did people deal with this, or what was the outcomes? The examples you mentioned, and I'm probably familiar with the Women's College Sunnybrook story, probably each one of them claimed that they were the more academic center than the other. The reality is that they probably were kind of equal. But what is your take on mergers between academic and non-academic organizations?
Usually, such mergers will sort of follow a feeder kind of model. That is, that the non-academic center will become a feeder institution of the academic center. And I've seen that in two large hospital networks where they acquire many smaller, often small town type of feeder organizations, which then push all their stuff into the academic center, particularly in pathology. It is essentially, I think, impossible to now practice as a solo pathologist. Even a small 2-3 person group is probably not functional. You can't. It's too hard. The business is too complex. You have to know too much. You can't do quality properly, etc. So those organizations look to outsource, and they usually just end up feeding. I think there's a very seldom. I can't think of a good example where the non-academic site is really held as a long-term functional laboratory site. They believe the lab should work as one, I think.
I'm wondering about the criteria for failure of the merger when these dissolved, when these mergers didn't work. Were there objective criteria in place, and were those benchmarks on an annual basis, or so you knew that this wasn't going well, or and what was the final?
That's something I didn't cover, although that certainly is in the literature as well. That the merger should have almost a yearly report card in terms of deliverables, right? Have we saved any money? Have we improved quality? Like hospitals do for many other things, like a report card. But no. You see, the mergers I've been involved in that failed were never as well thought out at the beginning as they should have been, right? And they sort of die the death of 1,000 knives, right? They lose momentum, people lose faith in it, and they spin out, they sort of dissolve. So, and I think that's why they're so painful. It would be, of course, far better to do as you've described, but that takes a very good conscious leadership team in order to compile that type of information that the merger is not meeting our criteria. But unfortunately, in reality, I have not seen that.
It was wonderful talk. Thank you. It's very timely given the discussions we've had and the non-merger occurred in the hospital system we work with. It would seem one of the key things would be sort of the philosophy and the values of the board or the shared board or whatever, because that sets the tenor for the hires at the C-suite, the most senior executives. So if you look at in the U.S. A great medical school, great medical center, Barnes Jewish, University of Washington. The University of Washington doesn't own the hospital. Barnes Jewish has committed itself over many years to become an academic medical center to provide funds for the research enterprise that makes WashU an outstanding place. But it's really having the board, I think, embrace that, so they hire executives who, their view is to, obviously decrease costs, but to make money so you can support the academic mission, residency and fellowship training, all those things. And unless you have that, it isn't going to happen. I think that was part of the issue we had with our partner, in that there wasn't that shared vision of the senior people on the board of what we want to be when we do this. And I wonder if you could comment.
No, I completely agree. I think that many hospital staff do not understand what the board does and do not even know why they're there. But you can't overemphasize because the board hires the CEO. The board's and the board is often, of course, very important in fundraising activities, etc. The board's power is very real in these matters, and it is totally their responsibility as well. So this is one of the few hospital matters which is really totally a board responsibility, and they must believe in each other. And I think you will be able to see from the outset whether or not those boards are compatible. You can see what sort of people are on them, what were their interests, why did they get on the board, and see if that will work out. Yes, please.
I don't know if you know our history, but we were bought in '97 by Pyramid Health System, just the hospital. and all the employees, the labs, everything. And we faculty were informed of it a few weeks before the deal was sealed. So you can imagine that we felt a sense of betrayal. And during the last saga, many of us have spoken out about not wanting to be betrayed again, but as it turned out, it failed. Your talk should have been given here 22 months ago, perhaps, or so. And it could, maybe it would have influenced the outcome. But two cultures, completely different. But to do a takeover without the stakeholders who work here, this is unheard of, really. I mean, it may go on elsewhere, but in the modern age, I doubt that that can happen again.
Well, and in a hospital, you're not dealing with, it's not like taking over an auto plant, okay? The staff, the desire of the staff to work hard, the desire of the staff to excel, the needs of the staff to actually believe in what they do. I mean, that's the heart of hospital employment and involvement, is that passion, right? That's what you really look for in employees. And you cannot, I completely agree with you, you cannot betray these people. And if you're having a merger which really makes sense, okay, intelligent, maybe I am naive, I know, but intelligent people should be able to be persuaded that this is in their interest or in their institution's interest. It shouldn't be such an impossible task. And it should start, again, very, very early, at the outset of the discussion. Not when it's all signed, sealed, and delivered, because the problems in morale are enormous and will be felt by the patients, because the staff will not come through like they used to. It can't be overemphasized, I think.
Would you comment on the experiences with diagnostic centers buying up community networks to be able to increase their market share with referrals?
I can't, no, but I think that you know something about that. That's a little bit, because of the medical system where I'm from, I don't know too much about that. I'm sorry, no. But I am, there is, where I'm from, a lot of problems with independent diagnostic centers competing with hospitals and eventually sort of taking out a lot of the profitable business. I've seen that. That is a great fear of hospitals. That what we call in Canada independent health facilities, which will be independent surgical centers and independent radiology centers, will eventually take away the referral base of the hospital. And that is a huge worry, yes. And probably a motivation for merger. Right? Yes, please.
Say something about who should be on the negotiating team between two merging entities, because the natural tendency is to put your leaders on that, but half of them may be out of work, in the first.
It should be, in the literature that I've read, and there are books written about how to merge, believe it or not, the team has to be, in fact, widely spread. You have to get the doctors on the team, or else they will feel left out. You have to, and importantly, you have to get the foundations, the patient representatives. They have to be on that team as well. Otherwise, not only will, yes, senior leadership, they will believe that their jobs are gone, and they won't buy it. But also the bigger hospital will be sure that what is going on in that merger room is something that they should be afraid of, right? So it has to be, you have to open the doors. I mean, it's 2016. You can't do these things in secret anymore.
Well, thank you, Simon. Thank you very much.